afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Fantasy Friday. So, today we've got a couple of shorter chapters coming up in The Tiger and the Wolf, so we will be reading chapters 3 and 4 today. And it's going to shift setting a little bit briefly, and we're going to get introduced to some new characters. So, let's see what they're like and see if we can figure out how to interpret what they're doing. So, without further ado, here is chapter 3 of The Tiger and the Wolf. The history of the crown of the world was a chronicle of the harsh land and brittle winters that either hardened the people there like old leather, or drove them out. Winter runners, cave dwellers, shadow eaters, eerie men, each had seized its chance to rule the rest, risen to its prime, then fallen in turn. The wolf were strongest now, but the crown of the world was a mutinous kingdom. No tribe had ever mastered it for long. In the riverlands of the south they told a different story, about building and growth. The Sun River Nation, that had once been just an idea in the heads of a handful of riverlord chieftains, had pushed its own borders steadily eastwards along the banks of the Sotek. All the other tribes had knelt before them, not destroyed or exiled, but consumed with the voracity of the Riverlord's own gluttonous totem, to be made a part of the body of the Sun River Nation that stretched out its length along the river. That part of the river that was the nation's heartland was known as the head of the Sotek, with the fragmented islands of the estuary forming the teeth in her jaws. Above the falls that framed the Riverlord's great city of Adolan, where the river turned northwards and began gathering in its tributaries, this was the Sotek's back, rough and uneven, and cutting into the side of the plains before her many tails split into the rivers and lakes and thousand streams of the crown of the world. On the back of the Sotek, heading from the endless summer of the riverlands north to where winter was already gathering, three boats moved. Long and narrow, hides stretched around wooden spars, they were sturdy enough to forge through the current with the sweat of their oarsmen, light enough to be carried over rapids and past falls where need be, and held steady in the water, each by their single outrigger. These were the canoes of the Horse Society, though they were seldom found heading north into the teeth of the cold at this time of year. Most of their brethren in the crown of the world would already be ferrying their rafts of timber back south, loaded with whatever goods and raw materials they had been able to barter for. These three boats did not carry traders, though, but passengers. Amidst the horse people were two men of the south, Asmander and Venator. The one was an earth-dark river-lord youth with an easy smile, the other a burly, villainous-looking estuary man, far from home. "The horse people are saying bad things about you because you will not row," Asmander remarked. "They say you cannot have been such a pirate as you tell them, if you will not set hand to oar." He was bare-chested, beaded with sweat from his stint, dashing himself with river water before pulling on his thin tunic. Venator eyed him balefully. "I didn't see you accomplishing much." "I did enough to assuage my honor." Their boat shifted as it ground its keel into the shallows. Some of the Horse Society jumped out to steady it and haul it to land. Asmander let himself over the side, plunging to his waist in water that was blessedly cool after the long, hot journey north, up the back of the Sotek. He put his shoulder to the vessel's side with the assured joy of a man who didn't have to, and could stop doing so any time he liked. Venator crouched beside him, not even bothering to get out, let alone put his prodigious strength to any use. "Well, boy, your father has my honor by the balls, and until he loses his grip, I'll be pissed on before I do anything for mere honor." "I don't believe you." Asmander was gritting his teeth at the effort, but he was grinning around it. "And I can see that me doing this work is eating you up. The soft young boy of the Riverlord's callousing his hands. Unheard of! Plainly this world is upside down and mad." He was tall and lean, with the dark, dark skin of all the river lords, his hair cropped short, save for a knot of it gathered at the base of his skull. His features were a good battleground for his customary expressions: amusement, mischief, melancholy. They had won him many hearts back home. He was a man who could have been married 3 times over, had he ever got round to returning any of his suitors' sentiments. He was the blade of his family, though, and wielded always, as now, to further the ambitions of his father. Dalliances and ready smiles were never allowed to turn into anything more serious. Asmander carried responsibilities.
If horse girls didn't make eyes at you so much, you'd not care,
Venator snarled.
show off for them all you like.
They're not my type. Asmander stepped back, clapping his hands together at a job well done. All 3 horsecraft were beached safely now on this foreign shore. 3 days before, they had left the northern edge of the Sun River Nation behind, no matter how optimistically one drew the maps. Since the river had taken them northwards, the land to the west had soared steeply away, rising to the heights that were the Stone Kingdoms. To the east lay the plains, green where the land met the river, but so much of it uncultivated, where in the south there would be fields and irrigation canals to wring the absolute most out of every hand's breadth of soil. Here in the drier lands the people were fierce and unfriendly. That much was known. They held and tilled only the land around their villages, because anything beyond that was simply setting out a meal for raiders from other tribes. They fought each other incessantly, held no oaths sacred, followed gods who valued nothing but blood, and ate each other's children for preference. Or so it was said amongst the river lords. Asmander knew full well that his own people's gods were also partial to their ration of blood. If old Crocodile liked his sacrifices to be public and ritualized, that still left the offerings just as dead as some heart-ripping festival of the plains people. He was a young man, cynical beyond his years, who could smile at a great many things that others held terribly solemn. He knew that, above all the gods and totems of the world, there was one great and controlling spirit, and it was named expediency. Honor was all very well, and something he pursued incessantly, and yet he was sourly aware that if one refused expediency its necessary sacrifices, then the good will of every other god, never mind all the honor in the world, would get you nowhere. At last Venator deigned to step ashore, getting no more than his bare feet wet. He was a broad-shouldered creature, a man of close on twice Asmander's age. A skin the color of wet sand was scarred by innumerable fights, then scarred again by the deliberate tallies of deeds his people kept, an intricate and secret history of murder, raid, and private brawl written in jagged wheals down the broad canvas of his upper arms. He wore his hair long and unkempt, framing a lantern jaw, hollow eyes hard like flint, a nose broken more than once. One of the horse society passed them by as they stood on the bank.
We must make a good showing for the laughing men, he told them.
Looking at the horse delegation, Asmander decided a good showing consisted of prominently displayed weapons.
Why are we even bothering? Venator growled. Your father is sending us off to die in the north, not at the hands of these scum.
He is not sending us to die anywhere, Asmander reproached. And we bother because the horse trade here, and they must keep the locals happy. And if we want to get any further north than this place, we must do as we're asked. The two of them were traveling light. Easier to ship River Nation coin than to clog the boat with everything they might need. Both were warriors, though, and when the laughing men came down to the river bank, they found in the two Southerners as martial a display as they could ask for. Asmander had donned a quilted tunic, with a plate of flat stone sewn into each pocket to make it hard armor. A stone-toothed wooden sword, the Makan of the river people, dangled from a strap at one wrist, and there were jade spurs at his ankles. Venator was already wearing a coat of shark skin, which made him a fearsome opponent to grapple and an unpleasant figure to sit next to in the close confines of a boat. Bracers of tortoise shell covered his forearms and the backs of his hands, and his weapon was the maret, a blade-edged club of greenstone which he kept thrust through the cord of his belt. His stance suggested that he would be only too glad if the horse diplomacy turned sour. The locals, the laughing men, were already making themselves known, sloping down the river bank with an insolent disdain. They were all on 4 feet, and Asmander knew that arriving stepped to a first meeting was common amongst the plains people. It hid what weapons they might be carrying, locked within those lean, flanked animal forms. He could see the glint of bronze in their teeth, but there was no way to know if they might suddenly leap into human form with arrows leaving the string, or spears taking to the air. Also, he had to admit, they were an intimidating sight.
Pretty lot, aren't they?
Venator growled. Probably he was wondering about fighting them. Fighting people was, to Asmander's certain knowledge, one of the few subjects that really occupied the older man's mind. Traveling with him was like walking under a sky constantly about to storm, human mind and beast soul united in perfect bloody-handed harmony.
These things are known. You list his good points,
Asmander told himself, with a slight smile. The shapes the laughing men took were not like lions, nor like dogs, but some distant cousin of both, or neither. The largest had shoulders that would rise to the hollow beneath Asmander's ribs, and the least of them would come up to his waist. They were made oddly, 4 quarters broadly muscled, and front limbs longer than the rear. A crest of hair ran down their spines, and their pelts were tawny and spotted with ragged patches of black. Their heads were vulpine, heavy-jawed with baleful dark eyes. When they yawned, they showed a nest of dagger teeth that would give even a river lord pause. As they approached, one or another would let out a weird cackle unpleasantly close to a human laugh. By standing there as they were, with all their weapons on display, the horse were signaling that they came without deceit. Asmander wondered idly if that would work with these ferocious-looking creatures. There were few who lived among the head of the Sotek who had any kind words for the plains tribes, although, perhaps, that was just because the only examples that came their way tended to be raiding parties. For a moment, while the horse stood firm, the laughing men coursed around them, sniffing and heckling, thrusting their noses at their visitors and baring their fangs in disconcerting grins. They had drawn off a little, though still in a loose crescent that penned their visitors against the water. They stepped lazily, seeming to stretch out into human form as though waking from dreams of blood and carrion. There were more women amongst them than men, Asmander saw, and certainly it was the women who had made the larger beasts. They had the long limbs and spare frames of the plains people, and that skin like bright copper. The men had heads shaved to the scalp, but the women just cut theirs at the sides and sported coxcomb manes dyed in patterns of gold and black and red. There was a lot of metal worn at necks and wrists and ankles, copper, bronze, and gold set into plates of bone and horn. Many of the women had armor of stiff cotton panels, though the men wore no more than loincloths and cloaks of hide. Long-headed spears and javelins were much in evidence, and Asmander could see Venator tensing, readying himself for a fight, much as another man's mouth might fill with saliva at the scent of food. "Are we not welcome?" The horse people's hetman, Eshmir, spread her hands. She was the only one amongst the visitors not armed at all. "Perhaps your Malikah may wish some talk with us? Or with these, our guests?" The leader of the laughing men, the oldest looking of the women there whose skin bore the memories of many fights, nodded easily. They all smiled readily, these plains people. Everything seemed to amuse them, and no doubt killing these new arrivals would just make them smile more. Asmander liked that honesty about them. "Who are these, your guests?" their leader asked. The hetman offered Asmander a small nod, letting him know that the laughing men expected visitors to speak for themselves.
I am the first son of Asman, he announced. I am a champion of the River Lords.
He watched their faces to see if that meant the same to them as it did to his own people, and was satisfied to see that it did. Enough widened eyes and thoughtful glances there to know that they understood him. He looked to Venator, who was scowling and plainly not about to play along, leaving Asmander with the difficult job of introducing him. He would rather I humiliate him than he has to do it himself.
This is Venator, sworn to my family.
It was the kindest way to say it, for all that he probably owed his companion no kindness. Better than a notorious but ultimately failed pirate, certainly. A little trade, a little talk, gifts. The hetman displayed her open hands. Friendship between the Laughing Men and the Horse Society. Friendship between the Laughing Men and the Friends of the Horse. The woman who led these laughing men regarded them haughtily for a moment, as though contemplating driving them back into the river. Then she laughed, and the sound was just as they had made when stepped into their animal shapes, wild and mad.
Come then! The Malikah likes gifts and her mates like trade. Friends? We shall see.
Dwellings of the Sun River Nation tended to be at least half underground, digging into the cool earth to ward off the daily height of the sun. The village of the Laughing Men, however, was all in the earth, barely rising above the level of the ground. Although their goat and cattle pens stood out, Asmander saw little sign of an actual settlement until they were nearly upon it, and he realized that the 30 or so raised mounds of dry grass were actually roofs. They lived in pits, did the Laughing Men, a scattering of holes in the ground, secluded and sheltered, with no fear of flooding in this dry land. He thought it all looked barren and primitive, but when the plains life was not about showing your wealth to the sky. When they had come to the biggest hut, and descended the steps carved into the packed earth, he found the area within was surprisingly spacious, three-leveled, and with the largest room there being the deepest. The day was ebbing, and at first Asmander was just stepping down into darkness, twitchy with a sudden sense of danger. Up above, though, children were already letting down pots of flame, suspending them by ropes from the spars that supported the roof, making an elaborate constellation that cast 1,000 patterns of light and shadow all about the curving walls. There were paintings there, intricate and complex, human and animal figures, abstract designs, mountains, and rivers. 100 legends had been sketched out and intermingled in bright colors around the confines of the Malikah's home. Most of the horse party were being hosted elsewhere. Only the hetman, their chief trader, and her 2 southern guests had the honor of meeting the ruler of these laughing men. The trader became almost immediately ensconced with a pair of the locals, falling to discussing commodities for the coming year, with an ease that told Asmander that all this threat and show was a ritual path both sides had trodden many times before. It was the first such sign. Till then he had begun to wonder if these plains people were sharpening their bronze knives for the throats of their guests. The Malikah of the Laughing Men was a woman as old as Venator, and just as battle-scarred. She wore a cloak striped with many colors, and a leather headband set with the teeth of lions rested in her tawny hair. She had a fierce beauty about her, as did so many of these plains people. Every sign of the hunt and the fight that had marked her skin only added to her sense of presence, and now she fixed Asmander with a frankly acquisitive stare. "Champion of the River Lords!" she addressed him. "But you are no more than a boy!"
I am as you see me, he replied, sitting across the floor from her. So young, and yet a champion.
Asmander, first son of Asman! Your father must be proud! He kept his smile steady, although, for a second, it was difficult.
The honor of our family rests in me, Malikah.
And so he casts it away? For a moment he wondered what she had been told, but no. She was simply fishing, dangling a paw in the water to see what she might catch.
The cold north calls to me. I would see the snows of winter.
Her eyes turned to his companion.
And you must be a young man too, even with your old face, Venator.
Making great play with the end of his name, that juvenile suffix.
Your father, is he proud also?
I am all of my house. Venator met her gaze steadily.
But you have found a new father in the River Lords? How kind of them.
I piss on the golden doorsteps of the River Lords, the burly pirate told her.
These things are known. He does,
Asmander confirmed wryly. Her eyes had narrowed, but she seemed content not to peel back Venator's past any more than that.
Men come to us from the south sometimes. Men who offer us bronze coin to fight. Do you offer us coin to fight, champion of the Riverlands?
No. An easy shrug, and he had guessed that there would be some from the nation who had sought mercenaries here. After all, why else was he himself heading north, if not to try and tempt the fabled iron wolves to support his prince, his childhood friend? As always, thinking on the man his family had sworn allegiance to, Asmander felt a point of pain as though the knife was at his own chest. His honor and his family duty were both stretched tight about the success of this mission. He only hoped that the two did not part company, or he would be like a man caught with each foot on a different boat. Thinking on his father, he was grimly aware how honor and family seldom shared the same house these days. Eshmir the hetman spoke then. She was a foundling of the horse, with the flat features and snub nose of a northerner, but the ruddy skin of the stone people, and she danced carefully through a conversation with the Malikah that elegantly checked and repaired all of the ties the society had built there. While she spoke, the subdued, slope-shouldered men who were the Malikah's mates, or slaves, or both, passed back and forth with gourds of a liquor that made Asmander's eyes water. Venator, he saw, was putting the stuff away with gusto.
Champion of the River Lords, he snapped back to himself as the Malikah addressed him. When you return to your lands in triumph, no doubt you will lead your own house. Many things are possible, Asmander allowed. Before then, will you drink your fill of the women of the crown of the world, and cause them to lament your leaving them?
She had a cruel smile on her, as she toyed with a necklace of horn and gold.
Even this is possible. They are cold up in the crown of the world. They have no fires such as we have here.
It was plain what she was after, and it was because he was a champion, that rare and special thing. The laughing men had none, he had heard, but their enemies of the lion did, and perhaps she foresaw his seed and her womb breeding a hero of the next generation. In truth, there was a power to her that was greatly attractive, as power always was, but he shook his head regretfully.
Alas, I am sworn to my father. My loins are not my own.
She snorted at that, and Venator muttered a snide.
This much is known,
Which made Asmander want to hit him.
Do none of my beautiful daughters catch your eye for just one night?
The Malikah asked him, and that made him sad for a moment. The space that was between them was not contained merely within the interior of her hut. It was the years between his youth and her age. There was no sign of it on her face, but her words showed that she felt it.
You honor me.
The most polite of all refusals, contained in the tone and not the words, and she did not press him further. Alright, so that's the conclusion of chapter number 3. And because chapter number 4 isn't terribly long, I think we'll read that one as well. So here it is, chapter number 4. To navigate the sides of the pit, Maniye stepped to her tiger shape again, descending with the beast's agility, but human forethought. All the while the snake's cold eyes were fixed on her, and not a muscle of him moved. Only when she had descended to his level did she realize that she had given him a weapon against her. She had revealed her mother's shape to him, that she had hidden so assiduously from everyone she knew. For a moment she froze, close enough to the huddled man that she could have dug her claws in him. Had he enchanted her somehow, that she had made such an error? Where had her habitual caution gone? Then she understood it. He is dead. She was already thinking of the snake as a dead man. The wolves do. Why hide secrets from a corpse? She stared at him challengingly. Only his eyes moved to meet hers, that and a slight shivering. His breath plumed in the night's chill. He could not reach her with his hands, and he could not step. He might have tried to kick her, but it would profit him nothing, and he was such a feeble, used-up looking creature that she would hardly feel the blow. A snake without fangs. She fell back into her human form, stepping to leave herself with her back up against the pit's earthen wall. The stone, wood, and bone pricked at her hand, and she shoved the trinkets into the waistband of her shift. The old man still said nothing. Close to, she was struck even more by the two sides of him, strange and pale and foreign, and yet so dirty and ragged and thin that even Coyote would call him starved. She had 100 questions, but what came out was, "Are you really a Southerner?" His withered lips moved, and then he spat, not at her, but at the ground, clearing his mouth of old blood. "Compared to you," he got out. "I thought Southerners were burnt black by the sun." She had heard it from the Horse Society, who traveled further than anyone else she knew. A smile's ghost brushed the corners of his mouth. Those eyes, as pale and moon-colored as the rest of him, wrinkled a little. "Most of 'em are," he got out, fighting the words. "I'm sh." A spasm of annoyance rippled his features, and he made the sibilant by drawing breath sharply inward across the roof of his mouth. "Special." Something small and mean turned within her, seeing him momentarily pleased at overcoming the limitations even by that small degree. "They're going to sacrifice you to the wolf." He nodded once, the smile gone. "Do you know how they'll do it?" she pressed. "The stone face of Wolf has iron teeth, more iron than you've ever seen. They'll tie you between his jaws and light a fire in his throat, and the teeth will get hotter and hotter until you roast in his mouth." It felt horrible to say the words, but at the same time it was a weird release, a catharsis she could not quite pin down. Another bleak nod, and he even managed a shrug. She had more hurting words already crowding her mouth. She wanted to make him see the utter despair of his position, and, even as she opened her mouth, she understood the petty hand that gripped her. Here was a creature lowlier than she, without even the meager freedoms of a thrall. Here finally was someone she could hurt without fear of reprisal. She stopped the words, killed them in her throat, and disowned them, and instead the two of them just stared at each other for a long while. "What is your name, child?" came his soft, mumbling voice. "Maniye." She said it without thinking. A moment later, a moment too late, she was wide-eyed with wondering whether he could work some magic on her, simply by knowing her name. Filthy and wretched as he was, surely he still had a curse or two to spare for a foolish girl who did not keep her name close. "I am Hesprec Esch." He made a determined effort. "Hesprec Essen Skese." It was a great deal of a name for this dried-up stick of a man. "Are you really a priest?" Again, that guarded nod. "When they kill you, will you curse Kalameshli takes iron, our priest? Will you curse the chief?" His eyes were fixed on her, and she realized that she had not seen him blink once since she came down to join him. "Your father, tiger girl." Abruptly she was frightened of him again. Even dying in the wolf's jaws, he might betray her, after all. She wondered briefly if she had the courage to kill him here and now, whether as wolf or as tiger, but knew that she did not. "Why did you come here?" she demanded. And he laughed. It was a sound as weak and pitiful as he was, but his narrow shoulders shook with it. "Seeking the wisdom of the north to speak with your priests." "Then you're a fool." "I cannot deny it," he sighed. "How many years have I seen, and yet I am a fool." He spat again. "When will it be?" "The day after tomorrow is the testing," she told him, and the thought sent dread coasting past her like the north wind. "The day after there will be a feast, and you will die. Aren't you going to ask me to free you?" The words came out without ever forming them in her mind. Once spoken, she clamped her hands to her mouth, but too late now to call them back. He regarded her coolly, then shifted his body sinuously, tucking his knees even higher, holding as much warmth as he could to himself. "Why would you do that?" Not bitter, but a question posed with genuine interest, and it sank its hooks into her. She found herself thinking of reasons immediately, each one more appealing than the last. "Is he doing this to me? Am I doing this to myself?" Abruptly, she had used up her stock of daring. Being in this forbidden place, with this terrible, tragic old man, was more than she could bear. She stepped back to the tiger and raked her way up the side of the pit, hoping that nobody would examine it too closely on the morrow and see where her claws had been. At the lip she paused, hunched low and looking for the watchmen, but by now they were both asleep. They did not fear that the old man would escape, and nobody had even thought about some wilful girl deciding to go down into the pit. She stepped again into her wolf, her smallest shape, and padded swiftly back towards the foot of the chief's mound. She thought of him often during the next day, as she stayed out of the way of everyone. Hesprec Essen Skese. That awkward foreign name had lodged indelibly in her mind. She decided she would creep out to speak with him again that night. After all, it was not as though she would have many more chances. By that evening, though, the testing had grown to encompass her entire horizon. She could think of nothing else. All day, Kalameshli had been giving her his cold looks, as if to say, "Just you wait." And Broken Axe had been seated just a few places from her, a guest at the chief's fire as he always was. He went wherever he willed, but whenever he came home to the winter runners, there was no more popular man than Broken Axe. It was a popularity born of fear, she knew. Oh, they hardly feared him like she did, but there was fear there none the less. Here was a wolf who needed no pack, a taboo breaker, a lone walker. A gift of food and shelter might buy him for a little while, but here was a man who might be capable of anything, severed as he was from the ties of hearth and family. And his eyes had strayed to her more than once as he ate. He had eyes like nobody else, did Broken Axe, pale blue like spring ice set in the gaunt brown leather of his face. She did not dare sneak away from her lair to seek out the doomed snake that night. She had the unshakable thought that she would find Broken Axe out there, waiting for her. What does he want with me? There were few possibilities, none of them pleasant. And the next morning they were preparing the ground for the testing, and all the mad energy that had infused her peers over the last month was abruptly gone. She stepped out into the chill morning, and saw them standing about as though someone had died. They were afraid. This was the day their lives had been leading to, and they all of them feared now. Theirs was a different character of fear to her own. They feared bruises and welts, and the humiliation of making mistakes before the whole tribe. None of them was going to be singled out by Kalameshli Takes Iron, after all. None of them ran the risk of ending the day without family and tribe, cast out from the wolf and destined to burn in his jaws. She remembered now the perverse glee that had gripped her as she described the old man's fate to him. Somehow she had overlooked that it might also be hers. Up on the temple mound, before the forge where Kalameshli labored, lay the training ground. Usually it was a place of young hunters and warriors running, wrestling, casting spears, and stepping. Now the whole tribe thronged around its edges, down to the meanest boar or deer thrall, and a course had been laid out with painstaking care for the boys and girls who would end this day as men and women of the wolf. Each year it was different, this course, but the intent was the same. The youngsters would be harried from one end to the other, and to make a swift progress past all the obstacles, they must step from child to wolf and wolf to child, until at last their final transformation would be into an adult. There were stretches of open ground where a wolf might break away from its tormentors, and there were obstacles that a swift youth might vault over. There were logs to balance along and narrow holes to dive through. The crowd was already in high spirits. For the young trialists, this might be a day that would stand by them for the rest of their lives, for good or ill, but for everyone else it was sheer entertainment. All the adult wolves, the old especially, were hoping for a good crop of embarrassments to laugh at and retell later. The lucky few that Kalameshli had chosen were already standing by with rocks and rotten yams and sticks, quite ready to make the trialists' lives an utter misery for the handful of minutes in which they were being tested. Maniye had been trying to retreat into the crowd without thinking about it, pulling her usual trick of being overlooked. Without warning, her father was at her elbow, one hand gripping her shoulder painfully. "Go!" he told her flatly, giving her a shove towards where the others were already gathering at the head of the course. She cast what she hoped was a fierce glance back towards him. It had no discernible effect. There were over a score of others to take the test today, every youth of Maniye's age in the whole of the winter runners. 17 she knew by name, but the rest had gathered from everywhere under the runner's shadow. They stood, all of them naked except for a loincloth, backs braced against the punishment they knew was coming. Now Kalameshli was striding forwards, the thick staff in one hand ridged with the blades of flints that the wood had grown around before it was cut. The myriad bones stitched to his robe, animal and human, clattered and chattered. He singled out one of the hopefuls wordlessly, a boy. There were some calls of encouragement, rather more jeers and mockery. That was the way, part of the ordeal. Kalameshli barked out permission, and the youth was off, springing instantly onto all fours, but stumbling a little, having to compose himself before he could master the transformation. Already the handful of beaters were throwing missiles. Maniye heard a wolf's yelp as the boy's hindquarters were struck by a stone. He flinched back as he reached the felled trees, knowing he should step to 2 feet to clamber across it, yet fearful of being struck. The beaters were already moving in behind, though, with staves and rods. Any contender who hesitated too long would soon regret it. When Maniye was 10, she had seen one boy frozen with fear, of pain or of failure, until they reached him, hailing blows upon him until they drove him forwards, meeting every obstacle unprepared. He had been bruised and bloodied by the end, barely standing, unable to meet the glowers of his people. He was a hunter now, though. He had survived and grown stronger. She watched the youth Kalameshli had chosen, knowing that he was at a disadvantage, the first to discover the course and its ways. Then he was struck full on by a rotten yam, and he would be dubbed Yamhead for at least a month after, his shame written in the tribe's collective memory, a joke that might hound him all the way to old age, unless he accomplished something remarkable to wipe it out. Then he was through, having run and crouched, jumped and balanced his way to the far end. Now his parents and uncles and aunts went to him, showering him with congratulations, welcoming him to the world of adults, giving him gifts. There will be no one there for me, Maniye reflected. But even to think that far presupposed that she would survive the course. The others were picked out at Kalameshli's discretion, and Maniye was not remotely surprised to find herself being left till last. All she could do was watch the others, learning what she could from their mistakes. Some of them were slow, some too timid, others reckless. They fell, they were struck, they tripped, they rebounded off the obstacles. One girl was hit with a stone so hard it shocked her out of her wolf shape, leaving her kneeling on the ground, clutching at her bloodied scalp and wailing. And yet she got back on her feet and went on, because to let the beaters catch up with her would be worse. One boy forgot himself so much that he left his loincloth behind as he stepped, arriving at the far end completely naked, for a moment horribly abashed, but then, realizing that he had passed the important test, strutting and whooping with his adolescent manhood dangling and dancing between his legs. Then they had all gone, all of them except Maniye. She watched the last of the pack, a girl she didn't like, harrying her off, stepping from human to wolf with the confidence of those who have seen the game played out plenty of times before. Even the beaters seemed content to let these last go with only a desultory barrage. Everyone was waiting for what came next. Everyone was waiting for her. She fixed Kalameshli with a stony gaze, which he met readily enough. From his expression, he might be looked at his worst enemy. He shouted out an order, and something was brought out from behind the temple. His 3 acolytes, brawny young men all, were sweating and straining to manhandle it, and the crowd eddied aside to let them through. It was a wall, she saw, a wall of logs lashed together, rising 10 feet straight up, and the acolytes dragged it to the middle of the course, securing it by ropes to the other obstacles. The crowd surged forward on either side until it formed a completely impenetrable barrier that divided one half of the training grounds from the other. The assembled tribe had gone very silent. No beaters had come forth for her, but every one of them fixed her with their eyes. She saw plenty of dislike there, those that felt she somehow wallowed in unearned privilege, and who were sufficiently mistaken to envy her relationship with the chief. They saw this as yet more special treatment, some sign that she was being accorded a special status. How about tomorrow's sacrifice? Is that status special enough? Kalameshli gestured imperiously, jabbing his staff at the course, and she walked over with deliberate, mulish slowness. Remember, his eyes seemed to say. She clenched her hands into fists. She had no wish to come so close to him, but no choice either. She could smell him distinctly, even with her human nose. Smoke and sweat and hot iron. He held out his flint-ridged staff, and one of his acolytes took it from him, handing him instead a razor-edged switch 3 feet long. She saw the sunlight glint off it, and knew that there would be stones bound into the last few inches. I will be right behind you, he said softly. Now, run! She was not going to give him the satisfaction until he cracked the switch, the flexible green wood making a sound like branches snapping. The fright of it had her stepping to Wolf without thinking, because the wolf was the fastest, and abruptly she was running from him, retreating back 10 feet and leaping up the first low barrier before she dared to turn and look. With no great hurry, Kalameshli was walking after her. His steps were slow, and yet every one of them seemed to eat up the ground between them. The stone-toothed branch twitched at his side. There was no expression whatsoever on his face. She turned and ran, coursing swiftly in her wolf shape, across the clear ground and putting distance between them. Then there was an earthen barrier to scramble up, human hands better than animal paws for that, and the tree to balance over. But she did it without thinking, without a moment's hesitation, and all the while Kalameshli was following patiently, and without hurry. Then the wall was before her, seeming twice as high now as when the acolytes had brought it in. The crowd thronged at either edge, watching her eagerly. She backed off, casting a look over her other shoulder. Kalameshli was just reaching the tree. The wolf could never make it, she knew, but it could still jump surprisingly high. She took a few more steps back and then dashed forwards on all 4 feet, leaping up and then stepping, even as she hit the wall, scrabbling for purchase, feet kicking, fingers clutching at the slick trunks. She fell back heavily, stepping to Wolf before she hit the ground, and twisting to get her paws under her. Kalameshli was close now. Impossible, surely, with all the lead she had won herself. But there he was. Seeing he had her attention, he cracked the switch again, making that broken sound. She faced the wall, feeling her heart speed. She tried scrabbling at it as a wolf, getting nowhere. She stepped to human, stepped back, dashing to either side, hurled back by the animosity of the crowd. And, within her, the tiger was awake and demanding its hour. She would be up and over the wall in seconds with its claws. It knew no walls or bounds. It was proud and fierce. It wanted to show them all just how fierce it was. Again the switch lashed, and this time she felt the breeze of it, whirling round and backing away from Kalameshli's steady progress, her tail between her legs, snarling at him in terrified defiance. His expression was disapproving, but not really disappointed. After all, surely this was what he had planned. Perhaps he had nurtured the thought of this moment for years, knowing that a time would come when not even her father's name would shield her from his hatred. She had no idea why he loathed her so, only that he always had. Something in him had looked on her, at the moment of her birth, and judged her unfit, as if their spirits had been enemies in past lives, human or animal both. Her back, her human back, was against the wall, and the voice of the tiger was loud in her ears, demanding to be released from the prison of her flesh. Before her stood only Kalameshli. His face twisted in a nameless expression she had never seen before, on his face or any other's, and he struck out at her. She screamed and flinched aside, and the switch scarred the wood beside her head. That could have been my face. That could have been me. He drew back his arm again. Everyone there, the entire tribe, was silent, almost reverent, watching their priest at his work, driving weakness from the wolf. She found that she could do nothing. She would have stepped to Tiger then, if she could, because she was beyond any thought of her future in the tribe. But fear of Kalameshli had frozen her in a strangling grip against the wall. Then he lashed out again, and the flint-barbed head of his whip tore into her arm and shoulder, splashing blood across the wood behind her, and he was already preparing for another blow. She let out a sound that was girl and wolf and tiger all at once, all in pain, and was up the wall, finding purchase from nothing, scrabbling and kicking with her breath coming in shuddering sobs. At her heels, the switch descended again, striking splinters just below her heels. And she was at the wall's summit, crouching there and staring down at him, and for a moment she had no idea what shape she was in, or where her stepping might have taken her. But those eyes with which she now glared down at Kalameshli, they saw the world in human colors, and what held her to the wall were her human fingers and toes, crooked into every little crevice and crack she could find, bleeding from the rough wood, her nails ragged and broken. And Kalameshli looked up at her, and where she expected to find bitterness was instead a kind of triumph, for she had mastered the personal testing he had set for her, and, somehow, the tiger remained caged. He had made her his creature, a thing of the wolf only. She slipped down over the far side of the wall, feeling numb. The rest of the course she walked. Nobody threw anything at her. Kalameshli did not follow any further. His point was made, and he was satisfied. At the course's end, nobody was there to greet her and exult with her, but she had expected that. By then her shoulder was agony, and she went to make a poultice to bind over it that would dull the pain. It would be grim work, one-handed, but nobody would do it for her, nor would she trust them to. Later, when the tribe had begun the raucous celebrations that came after the testing, Smiles without teeth came for her and told her that her father demanded her presence. And that concludes chapter 4 of The Tiger and the Wolf. So, quite a bit of stuff going on there. Kalameshli scared the tiger right out of Maniye and forced her to climb that 10-foot wall of logs in human form while he was whipping her. So that's quite intense and shows how harsh he really is. But it improves the strength of the wolf, and they've been doing so for generations. So maybe there's something to it. Maybe there isn't. We'll find out in chapter number 5 next week. So I look forward to seeing you again then, Friday at noon. And until then, enjoy your weekend. Bye now.